Welcome to the podcast, Restore Yourself, Restore Your Marriage, where it's all about discovering the thoughts that get you in the mood, the thoughts that get you out of the mood, and how creating a deeper connection with yourself creates a deeper connection with your spouse. I'm your coach, Shelly Anderson, coaching you through life, love, and intimacy. This is episode number 127, Overreacting and Under-reacting in the Marriage Relationship. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast today. We are going to do something just a little bit different. We wanted to give you some insight into one of our most in-depth courses on intimacy. And this course is called the Emotional Intimacy Effect course, Intimacy Beyond Sex. Now, this is our most comprehensive and most in-depth course that we have on intimacy, including all the traps that we fall into that keep us out of the mood and how to resolve those things. But also we cover some amazing topics like the self-coaching model and the intimacy trek. And so what we wanted to do today is give you a piece of this course, just to give you a little feel of what's included. Now, this course by itself on the website is $97, and that's an amazing price for what you actually get. But the good news is that starting in January, we're going to have this amazing membership called Make It Meaningful. And when you sign up for this monthly membership, you're going to get this course for free. That's right. So as long as you're a member, you're going to have that course and full access to it whenever you want to. So let's dive into this concept of being overreactive and underreactive and what it does to our relationship. Okay, so when we naturally want to react as a human being, we usually fall into some very particular traps. And we're only going to talk about one of those traps today. And this trap is being reactive. And we're going to find out that being reactive comes in two forms, being overreactive and underreactive. Now, this is a trap that we fall into because even though we're technically adults, legal adults by age, we're going to find that when we start acting in overreactive and underreactive ways, we are actually falling into a trap of emotional childhood. And this means that instead of acting like mature adults, we are going to resort to very toddler-like and juvenile tactics to try and solve our problems. This is simply a sign to ourselves that we are lacking some marriage maturity and proper marriage skills that are actually effective. Now, when we fall into this trap of being reactive, we're going to find out that the results are going to keep us from feeling in the mood for intimacy. So instead of wanting to be closer to our spouse in a natural way, we are going to feel the opposite. We are going to feel that we are not in the mood very often. So let's dive in to this concept of being reactive. Let's start off by defining it. To be reactive means acting in response to a situation. It means we do that rather than creating a situation or doing something to prevent it. That means instead of doing something ahead of time, we're just on the reactive end of it. It also means showing a response to a stimulus. And finally, it means occurring as a result of stress or emotional upset, especially from factors outside of ourselves. Now, this is where it can be very easy to also just blame, right? Like, look at all these things that are happening. Look at all the things that are going on. Look what my husband did. Look what my husband didn't do, right? Our brains can really go down that rabbit hole. And when we don't have the ability or the skills to slow our thinking down and to actually challenge those thoughts, it will become very easy to fall into this trap of being reactive. So let's talk about these two forms that being reactive can come in. So the first form is being under-reactive. This means that when we are responding to something, that we're doing with less than appropriate force or intensity. And we may think initially like that's always better, but it's not necessarily the case, and we'll discuss this. To be under-reactive means with less emotion than expected. It means to react inadequately. And sometimes if there's like major events or major situations that you're facing in the relationship, being under-reactive means, man, maybe if someone has passed away and there's no response, then that's not going to be quite congruent. And finally, it means with less sufficient emphasis or enthusiasm. And so I'm sure all of us can relate to times where we have been faced with a situation and we have underreacted. So let's talk about some examples of what this might look like. Some examples might be avoiding, escaping, and disconnecting. Can anyone think of any specific ideas for this one? I know I can for sure. Video games, scrolling through social media, Candy Crush. Sometimes just the action of avoiding. Maybe there's a conversation that really needs to take place between you and your husband, you and your spouse, and you're just avoiding it, right? You don't want to feel uncomfortable. You don't want to actually go through the process of having a conversation. You might have some doubts or fears about how that process will go. So you just avoid it altogether, right? You just don't have the conversation. You don't make eye contact. You don't initiate. There's a lot of avoiding tactics that humans tend to fall into or turn to. And disconnecting, right? We just kind of put up those walls and say, I'd rather just not do this. Let's just pretend this is not happening. Let's pretend these problems don't exist. Some more examples would be tuning out. Maybe when you are having a conversation and you're trying to have it, you just still don't want to face the facts and you just kind of tune out to what's being said. Numbness. This can happen in a lot of different ways. I think the most common would be just some of the vices that exist out in the world. Drugs, alcohol, lots of shopping, gambling, just ways to mentally numb yourself from what's going on. And also self-medicating. Some more examples of being underreactive and not actually facing the challenges that are coming up in the relationship would be porn, gambling, drugs, and vices, kind of like what we just said. Another one that might not be so obvious is people pleasing. That's just saying yes to everything so that there doesn't have to be any confrontation. Again, trying to get out of having those difficult conversations and sometimes staying and remaining in bad situations. Instead of improving them, we're just allowing them to continue in ways that are not healthy or beneficial. Another way that we are sometimes underreactive is by having a lack of boundaries. The biggest misconception about boundaries is that they put a strain on relationships or they make them more complicated. But the opposite is actually true. When we set up healthy boundaries for ourselves, the relationship can actually grow in a way that is so much more healthy and beneficial. But a lot of times, since that's not something we're taught in school, we don't know how to put up healthy boundaries. And so we just continue to allow people to walk all over us and treat us poorly without making those changes that need to be made in the relationship. Another way of being underreactive is having a lack of self-care. And this means that we're not jumping to being so selfish that we're just shutting off the whole world and shutting everyone out of our lives. But it means that, hey, there needs to be some downtime for ourselves to mentally decompress, to emotionally decompress, and physically decompress from everything that's going on. When there are challenges in relationships, it usually takes a toll on every aspect of our lives. And we can find that our stress levels are going up and that we start to just feel more exhausted. And so lack of self-care and just trying to work even more and never taking a break for ourselves to mentally decompress is also a form of just being underreactive. So we've got to get some of that self-care in. And finally, becoming a workaholic. Now, even though working a lot and being a workaholic is a lot of work, we might not put that into the category of underreactive because we might assume that underreactive means doing nothing. The reason being a workaholic is under this category of being underreactive is because you're still not actually facing the challenges that are there that need to be addressed. You're still avoiding what is actually going on. So that is another form of being underreactive. Now, if you take a moment to kind of reflect on some of these aspects of being underreactive, we can see that if we are constantly escaping and turning to our vices and self-medicating, if we are constantly people-pleasing, we don't have boundaries, we're not taking care of ourselves, or we're becoming a workaholic, you can see that all of these things are going to have a major effect on how we feel about being intimate with our spouse. If we are falling into this category and we're constantly working, it's going to be hard to tune into that side of ourselves. If we're constantly people pleasing, we're going to feel like, hey, where's the time for me to actually want to be close and feel my own desire to connect with my spouse? And so falling into this category of being underreactive really prevents our natural desire for intimacy from coming through naturally. Okay, let's move on to the next form. So the next form is being overreactive. So this is the exact opposite. To be overreactive means to do something with more emotion or more forcibly than what is justified. I'm sure all of us know somebody who is overreactive. And sometimes they seem to just fly off the handle and their emotions seem a lot bigger than what the situation is actually calling for. And usually what ends up happening is we find out that it's not so pleasant to be around somebody who's overreactive because we feel it's unpredictable, it's unsafe. And so if we're thinking about this in the context of marriage and intimacy, can become very challenging to want to be intimate with somebody who we feel is unpredictable and unsafe and overreactive. Another definition of being overreactive is to react too strongly, right? Like their reactions don't match the situation. It's to respond with an emotion that is too strong or with an action that is extreme or unnecessary. So sometimes this will show up in the form of comments and criticisms, right? Like sometimes we can say things and attack a person's character when really they just forgot something simple that needed to be done. But it doesn't mean that they, as an entire person on a whole level, is bad. And finally, it means to take action without thinking. And I think this is the biggest one and the most important, is that we just take action without thinking. So a lot of times this will show up in just comments that just come out right away. We have never slowed our brain down when something has happened and we just say something mean. A lot of times when people start learning this concept that there's a space here, the space actually exists between the moment something happens, right? The circumstance that we're facing and our reaction. A lot of people think that that space does not exist, right? Our spouse did something and we're so mad instantly that we just have to say the thing that came to our mind. But this is not actually truth or reality. So what we need to do is actually learn that this space exists and that we can live in there. We can totally exist in that space, and that is actually where all of our power exists. Being able to slow ourselves down and say, okay, this just happened with my spouse and my emotions have shot through the roof and I really want to say some mean things right now. But instead, I'm going to see if I can find this space and see if it exists, and I'm just going to stay there for a few minutes. And I'm going to try and slow my brain down and observe my own thinking. I'm going to see if I can tap into what the thoughts that are actually going through my mind, and I'm going to challenge them. This is the place that we want to be in a relationship. So what we don't want to do is fall into this trap of overreacting all the time and thinking that this is the only way to respond and that we can't help it if we do respond this way. So we want to start to make that shift from thinking, I can't help it, that's just how I respond, that's just me, is we want to say, oh, there's actually a better way. I can totally respond, but I can think beforehand, and that is going to be more effective. So let's talk about some examples of what it looks like to overreact. This could be screaming, throwing things, and name calling, right? So let's say that you and your spouse are not seeing eye to eye on something that one of your kids did, right? You could just be so mad that you just take something and throw it at your spouse, right? We haven't slowed our brain down to really take a pause and say, is that the best idea to throw things? A lot of couples fall into this, right? Because maybe they don't want to say something mean, so they're just like, well, if I throw something and purposely miss, then that's better. But I just want to help you recognize that that is a form of being reactive. I think name calling is an obvious one and probably one that is very easy to do. And it could be that maybe the words and the actual mean names don't come out, but we are doing it in our brain, left and right. And so I want you to just be observant of what your brain is doing. If you find that your spouse has done something to get you mad, are you calling him names in your mind? Because if you are, just notice that you are falling into that trap of being overreactive. Screaming, I think, is the most natural one to fall into because a lot of times if we're not getting our way or we think things are going wrong, we want to raise our voice to try and control that situation. I think it's super helpful to try and remember in your relationship, what if you had the rule to never scream at each other, to never raise your voice at each other? Man, that is a great reminder and a great check for yourself to see if you're falling into that category of being overreactive. Oftentimes when we fall into the category of overreacting, we end up taking action that is rebellious and ends up actually going against the very thing that we want in our relationship. We end up taking actions that will push our spouse away when we actually want to feel close to them. This is a great reminder if we're doing something and we want to feel rebellious to really have that moment to reflect and say, this will probably end up with a result where I'm going in the exact opposite direction from what I want to accomplish in my marriage. Some more examples of being overreactive would be disregarding other people's perspectives. So this could come in the form of just like rolling your eyes when your spouse is speaking, always thinking that you're right and your spouse is wrong. So that means when you are having those tough conversations, it's so much easier to just throw what they're saying out and disregard it as invalid. So if you find that you're doing that, even just in your brain, even if those words aren't coming out, that's going to be a signal to you that we are falling into the trap of being overreactive. So another example would be having impulsive reactions that you regret later on. This is a classic sign that you are behaving in a way that's overreactive, is that regret. Whether it's 30 seconds later, 30 minutes later, or 30 days later, if you find that you are feeling regret for something you said in the heat of the moment or something that you did, that is a flashing neon sign that we have fallen into the category of being overreactive. And I just want to point out that living in regret is not a healthy way to live. That's not the goal of life. A lot of times, all these regrets end up just kind of piling on as we keep them from being resolved. And then at the end of life, all of a sudden we're faced with them, wondering why we didn't take care of them earlier on in our lives so that we could enjoy the relationship more fully. So if you find that you're a person who is regretting several things, now is the time to self-reflect and say, okay, I think I'm going to need to move into a more mature way of operating in the relationship. Another form of being overreactive is perfectionism, right? Things have to be a certain way. They have to be perfect. They have to run through the, A, B, C, D, and E, and they have to go in that order. Otherwise, we're not happy with the relationship. And we have all of our reasons and our justifications for our behaviors, right? Things are not perfect. This is a very tricky trap. And sometimes we may be in the state of thinking like a perfectionist and not really even realize that we're doing it. And so we really need to have that self-awareness of what our thoughts are doing and making sure that we're not falling into this category, because then we really will justify, oh, look, my spouse didn't do all these things that he should do and that he's supposed to know about. So I am totally deserving of not being in the mood to be intimate with him, right? This is what happens on a frequent basis. And finally, another way that we're overreactive is that we're making assumptions. This happens all the time. Our brain gives us thoughts at an unconscious level. And then they come to the front of our brain and we're like, oh, there's a thought. Because my brain thought it, it must be true. It has to be. Our brain thinks that our thoughts are always true, that they're always the right thoughts, and that they're always the correct thoughts. But this just isn't true. This is a huge trap. Making assumptions about what our spouse was thinking when they did this one thing, that assumption can cost us our connection with them. And so that is also a very immature way of living our lives, is assuming that we are mind readers and that we know what everyone's thinking, that we know everyone's intentions and their motives. We have to stop doing that, especially in our marriage. So what are the effects of all this under-reacting and overreacting on marriage? Well, it prevents us from being proactive. That's where we want to live. That's the space that is positive and beneficial and has the best effects on the relationship, is being proactive. But when we're constantly avoiding things or just screaming and yelling and name calling and being overreactive, it prevents us from getting into that super effective space. It also prevents us from being genuinely curious about our spouse and about better possible solutions. If our brain is always thinking that we're right and our spouse is wrong, we are very close-minded to the hundreds of possible solutions to whatever it is that we're facing. It's often hard to undo the things that we said or did in the heat of the moment, right? A lot of times our pride gets in the way and we don't want to apologize. We don't want to take ownership or responsibility for what we did. We feel too embarrassed. And so that becomes a challenge, and it can also just create more distance the longer that time goes on, that we're not coming to the forefront saying, hey, that was on me, that was my bad. And finally, it keeps us distracted so that the problem stays around even longer. Who wants to have more problems for longer? Right? I don't think any of us do. But when we remain being overreactive or underreactive and not actually dealing with the problems in a positive and effective way using skills, they stick around even longer, making us even more miserable. So let's not do that anymore. So what do we actually do? The first thing is, I hope that you will keep this mantra in your mind forever. It's such an effective one. And it goes like this. Never make decisions when you're mad. If we are trying to make decisions while we are angry, we are totally in reactive mode, overreactive. And so what we want to do is make sure that we are not in a place of anger or high negative emotions while making decisions. So never make decisions when you're mad. The second thing we can do is take proactive decisions ahead of time when you are thinking clearly, right? If you realize that you are feeling super angry or frustrated about something, just say in your mind, this is not the time to make decisions. I'm going to come back to that. And then either later on that night or the next day or however long it takes for you to be able to get into a place where your emotions are in check and you're calm and you're able to think clearly, that is the time to really be proactive and to be creative when it comes to problem solving. When you are thinking clearly and you're in that higher brain, use your creativity. And then finally, challenge your brain to think differently and to think better. Sometimes our brain needs us to challenge it to do better, to come back with a better idea. And so that's something we have the ability to do. And if you've never done it, that's okay. Just try it out. Try experimenting with it and say, okay, brain, I think we can do better than this. Let's try again. Let's come up with a better solution. And so you want to challenge your brain to think differently and to think better. This was just a snapshot of one little part of what's in our course, the Emotional Intimacy Effect course, Intimacy Beyond Sex. So I really encourage all of you to either get this course now on the website, shelly.andersoncoaching.com. It's only $97. It's an amazing, amazing price for the value. Or get yourself geared up to sign up to become a monthly member of our Make It Meaningful membership, where you will get this course for free. It's awesome. Okay, so we hope this next week that you'll be able to keep these concepts of being overreactive and underreactive in mind, and that you will really try to get into that space where you are making decisions ahead of time and when your brain is thinking clearly and creatively. Because remember, the more that you restore this type of intimacy with yourself, the more you restore it with your spouse. Thank you so much for listening today, and we hope you will join us again next week.